Welcome to the Authority Podcast, Plumbing and Mechanical. When talking about the built environment, we would do well to remember, we shape our buildings, and afterwards, our buildings shape us. Therefore, on each episode, we'll discuss the latest trends from IAPMO in plumbing and mechanical safety, sustainability, and resiliency. Join me, your host, Christoph Lohr, and together we'll explore the ways we can make our buildings shape us for the better. This episode is sponsored by Q-Flow International, offering innovative legionella membranes filters to stop and help prevent legionellosis and more. Just because it's clear doesn't mean it's clean. Joining me on this episode of the Authority Podcast, Plumbing and Mechanical, is Tina Donda, Vice President of Water Systems at IAPMO R&T. Tina, thanks so much for joining.
Of course, my pleasure.
So for our episode today, what we wanted to go through was just talking a sort of a general sense for our audience about lead in water systems. And the first question I have is, how did lead become so prevalent in American plumbing?
So I think the answer is really it comes down to people being naive. Prior to 1986, our lead service lines were made with pipe that contained lead. Our copper pipes, the solder that was used to connect those was leaded solder. And we just didn't know that it was going to cause harm to people. Since then, and post 1986, that the lead pipes are no longer being used. Leaded solder is no longer available. So we're seeing some relief for new systems, but for all of us that are on those old systems, it's really just comes down to education and not knowing when they were put in to begin with.
So how bad is lead in our drinking water in the U.S.? What does it do to people, especially children?
Yeah, so I think it's really region specific. So you can't really say that lead across the entire U.S. is really bad or don't worry about it. I think it's an issue for sure. It's something that we have to take very seriously, particularly for children, as you mentioned, but even pregnant women, because lead exposure can cause learning disabilities, as well as impaired formation and function of the blood cells, which of course is extremely important in developing children.
So how do you know then, with this threat of lead in our drinking water and all the potential negative health impacts, how do you know if lead is in the drinking water?
Yeah, the best way is to test your water. So the water that's coming from your tap. Regions and specific cities and areas do have consumer confidence reports that will provide you with information about the lead that is contained within the water as it leaves their facility, but that doesn't include the infrastructure. So the pipes that we talked about earlier, the water may be completely clear of lead as it leaves the municipality, but the infrastructure may add. So your best bet is to look up an environmental lab that has the availability to test for lead in drinking water.
So the testing criteria is a real important first step, but then obviously you can't just test and not do anything about it. So it seems that there's a lot of replacing of lead service lines, and that's a good thing. And we're definitely, I think, all glad that's underway. But it seems like that's going to take a while.
Yeah.
What other options are there for different municipalities and jurisdictions to trying to solve this today?
Yeah, so as far as at the municipal level, I know that there are some municipalities that seek to provide their users with certified devices to reduce the amount of lead in the water. This is typically going to be in areas of crisis. We're all familiar with the Flint, Michigan scenario. And some smaller water systems that service much smaller communities, they actually have adopted the use of combining multiple point of use or point of entry certified products to handle the reduction of lead at their facility as well.
So we have this idea of trying to get rid of lead in multiple ways. but I also am hearing a lot of these things talking about lead-free. So what does lead-free mean? You know, the EPA finally lead-free rule permits a weighted average of, 0.25% lead in pipes and plumbing fixture fittings when used with respect to wetted surfaces of a pipe. For our audience and for myself too, what does this mean? What is it like? Is it safe? If you can maybe describe or kind of help us all understand a little bit.
Yeah, so that's a good question, because the words lead free, I think when you jump on them, think, oh, great, everything's okay. But really, the lead free rule is talking about the percent content of lead within a product. It is not talking about the amount of lead that you are going to ingest by drinking water that has gone through that product. So the idea of safe is that lead-free products provide you with a assurance, or maybe a little bit more security, that that product is going to leach less lead than another product that is above those levels. But lead-free does not mean zero. And unfortunately, for a lot of people that aren't in the industry, free to them means zero. Right. But you've already described, you've said 0.25%. So that 0.25% meets those requirements. But sometimes when the water flows through it, the water pulls out that lead at concentrations above the allowable levels set by the EPA for the amount of lead that can be in drinking water, which means you could be consuming more than what you should be.
This is a real education for me, Tina. And this is really interesting points that you make. So if there's still 0.25% of lead or allowable in our systems right now, with the health effects that you mentioned before, it seems like some people will maybe want to, take an added step. Is there any kind of current types of filters that can remove lead from drinking water? How do they work? How effective are they? Is there something that people can do, at the tap to try to reduce to address any concerns that they have?
Yeah, so they're the most common, and certainly not the only ways, but the most common ways are through filtration products that are specifically manufactured and certified to reduce lead. The reason that I say specifically manufactured that way is because in order to reduce lead in a filtration type product, they typically have to use a very specialized media that attracts and absorbs that lead. If we're using just a standard carbon filter, for example, that's not going to do everything you need to get down to the levels that are required. The other technology is reverse osmosis technology, which is also good at reducing lead. That technology actually separates the water. So the water that has the higher concentrations of lead goes to the drain, and the water that is acceptable goes to the end user to the tap. Both methods are effective for reducing lead. Just making sure that they've actually been tested to do that, because not all products will, but if they've been tested and can prove it.
So that kind of gets to maybe skipping a little bit ahead, but how are they tested to know that they're going to perform?
So there's a few different principles. The industry actually has created standards for this type of testing. So both for RO technology and filtration technology, standards exist. So for filtration, the lead standard, or the lead reduction test, is found in NSF ANSI 53. For reverse osmosis, it's NSF ANSI 58. And in very simple terms, the products are introduced with high levels of concentration of lead. So the approximate level is 150 parts per billion of lead is introduced to these products. The test is run over the course of, for filter products, over the course of its capacity. So you'll see that a company says remove and replace this cartridge at 500 gallons, we'll say. So for filtration products, we run the test actually beyond that capacity. So there's a safety factor. Obviously, we've talked about it a couple times already today that it's not good. So there is a safety factor built into that testing. For reverse osmosis, there's no capacity related because it's about separation, but that test is run for a certain period of time. Every sample point that we collect throughout the duration of this testing has to show that it reduces that 150 part per billion concentration of lead to at or less than 5 parts per billion. So it's pretty significant how much reduction these products have to be capable of in order to be certified.
So, wow, that's amazing. So you're going from a test water of about 150 parts per billion, and the test requires you to get below 5. What is the EPA limit again for the amount of allowable lead in the water?
I want to say it's 10 right now. They have a couple different,
Okay.
they have maximum contaminant
Yeah.
goals. They have allowable concentrations. The goal is obviously 0. But in an analytical world, it's very difficult to record 0.
Yeah.
Our instruments just can't see that low. They can't
Yeah.
be confident that they can see 0.
So, and then really, I mean, the water that should be delivered by the EPA, and I'm sorry for the little bit of tangent. I mean, it should be below 10. So if you're putting water in there with 150 and getting it down to 5, I think there's a lot of assurance a consumer could have that these filters can handle, presumably something closer to 10, and getting those levels even, below 5 parts per billion or lower.
Course. Yep. That is the hope, that the testing is set up to be conservative. Certainly, we've mentioned Flint already today. Levels were way higher than 150 ppb in Flint, Michigan, when that crisis was happening. But for the general population, when there isn't a crisis going on, the tests that we are doing are multitudes beyond the levels that are typically seen within the water.
Fascinating stuff. So this is all really interesting. So there's a lot of confidence and assurance that the public can have in these filters. So in terms of construction in my history, there's always that progression and the various entities and stakeholders involved in maintaining a plumbing system, installing a plumbing system, putting it all together. And obviously the manufacturing side and the testing you and your colleagues are doing at IAPMO R&T on these, obviously there's a fair thought going into this and prep and procedure. What about on the back end though, on the install side? Is this something that, in terms of these filters, can anyone install them, or do you need a professional installer? Do installers need specialized training? Can you speak to that to our listeners here?
Yeah, so for someone that has a general plumbing knowledge, and I mean, more than water comes out of a faucet, more general plumbing knowledge than that, they probably can install most of these point of use type devices. If there is question though, I would certainly recommend getting a professional involved, because if you don't, and in particular with RO systems, we talked about there's drain lines and there's product lines and there's all sorts of things going on. If you switch those, you could be getting the drain line water to what you think is your good product water. So I do recommend that if you have any question, if you are not sure, don't tempt it. It's not worth it. But they're not overly complicated to install, but you definitely don't want to get it wrong.
That makes a lot of sense. So once you get it installed, what do people need to consider in terms of ongoing maintenance? How do they know that they're still protected?
Yeah, so my biggest shout out will be follow the manufacturer's instructions.
I feel like I put that on a lot of my plans too when I was doing design.
Right. It is so critically important. I'm a consumer myself, and I have tons of manuals and instructions. Have I read them all? Probably not. But the reality is, when you're talking about something that can negatively impact your health and your children's health, it is really critical to follow those instructions. So or I shouldn't say most, all certified products will have instructions associated with them that recommends when products should be replaced. And by products, I mean the elements within the complete system. So filtration, cartridge, an RO membrane, etc. Replacing those at the intervals at which the manufacturer recommends is critical. And if you keep doing that, then that is your best course of action.
Wonderful. Okay, so what can be done for people in underserved areas, places like Flint, Michigan, which I drove by just a few weeks ago when I was visiting family and friends in Michigan. There's a lot of these places that have, these underserved areas have poor water quality, and they might not be able to afford filtration systems. Is there an option to help them, or, short of some massive infrastructure investment?
Yeah, so the best option is what we've been talking about this whole time, is that point of use type product. There are different options on the market, and trying to find one that fits your fiscal needs is obviously the first step. If it is absolutely outside the scope of your ability to afford these types of products, my recommendation would be to go to the local jurisdiction and see if they have any government funds available to help with the needs of cleaning up the water.
That makes sense. Is there any, for any populations out there, is there a way that people need to safely dispose of the filtered wastewater?
So it's an interesting question, because I think a lot of people get confused about this concept, but the reality is that the water that's coming out, the wastewater, and it's particularly related to RO filters, because we talked about that waste stream versus product, has less lead in it than what went into it. So there are no special requirements for disposal of that water, because you are not putting into the water anything that wasn't already there.
Makes sense. When it comes to, and we're going to have another episode that talks specifically about PFAS, but with the remaining time here, is there anything that we should know, like in terms of, can these same filters, that remove PFAS also remove other threats such as lead from drinking water?
Sometimes. So your products that can remove lead are not always going to be able to remove PFAS, but similar technologies are used for PFAS reduction. So both the filtration and the reverse osmosis technologies also do well for that PFAS reduction. But the configuration and the way that the manufacturer puts these products together is a little bit different between the two technology, or the two chemicals that they're trying to reduce. So I talked about certified products already. The best bet is to make sure that if you have issues with both of those chemical types, look for that certified certified product that clearly demonstrates that it reduces both. And one thing that I'll add that I don't think I mentioned previously is that certification, it's critical to make sure you look for certification bodies that are accredited, because that means that they have been and continue to be reviewed to ensure that they're following the right procedures to issue those certifications. There's a lot of claims out there. There's a lot of claims that things are certified, that things take this out, that, my product is the best thing. But if it's not verified through an accredited certification body, some of those claims are just not true.
And I assume IAPMO R&T is one of those accredited third-party certification bodies you're speaking of there.
It is, yes.
Awesome. Well, one last question for our audience, I guess I'll throw one in here, is, you kind of gave a broad overview of lead filters specifically on our episode here today. If you were going to peer into the crystal ball and in a year's time we had you back on the podcast, in terms of lead filters, any future predictions, or what do you think we would be talking about the next time in terms of on the show on terms of lead filtration? Is there any trends in the industry that our listeners should be aware of?
I think there's a couple trends where companies are trying to delve a little bit more into the point of entry side of things. So not only at your tap, but as the water comes into your home. I know that there's a couple companies out there that have actually pursued that, but I do think that there might be more that are going to try and get into that side of things. But it's still filtration. It's just at the, at that bigger level where it treats all of the water in your home as opposed to individual taps. My crystal ball right now is not giving me a whole lot of other technologies that are coming up. Anion exchange resin can be used, but there's not a whole lot going on in the industry with it right now. So there's other options out there, but the two that I talked about are the most prevalent and are probably the most prevalent because they do such a good job with it.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of the Authority Podcast, Plumbing and Mechanical, Tina, it was absolutely wonderful to have you on the episode today, and hope you'll come back soon.
I would love to. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode of the Authority Podcast, Plumbing and Mechanical. Love this episode of the podcast? Head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Please follow us on Twitter @AuthorityPM, on Instagram @TheAuthorityPodcast, or email us at iapmo@iapmo.org. Join us next time for another episode of the Authority Podcast, Plumbing and Mechanical. In the meantime, let's work together to make our buildings more resilient and shape us for the better.